Good evening. My name is Michelle Yun, and I'm Vice President for Global Artistic Programs, Director of the Asia Society Museum, and Artistic Director of the Asia Society Triennial. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Asia Society for the panel discussion, Looking Like the Enemy, Race and the Legacy of the Vietnam War. This panel discussion is the second program in the series Harmony and Dissonance, Deconstructing Ethnicity and Agency in America, organized in conjunction with our inaugural Asia Society Triennial, which opened to the public on October 27th. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Triennial, it's the first reoccurring initiative in the United States with a mandate to champion contemporary Asian and Asian American artists within a global context. The Triennial provides an internationally recognized platform for these artists to push the boundaries of their respective art practices and to meaningfully engage with audience whom they may not otherwise encounter. The inaugural edition will be on view in two parts from October 27th to June 27, 2021, and will be accompanied by an exhibition catalog and a robust roster of public programs. The inaugural edition, We Do Not Dream Alone, features over 40 artists from 20 artist groups, 40 artists, and artist groups from over 20 countries from across Asia and the diaspora, and features interdisciplinary mediums. We hope that you'll be able to come visit the Triennial. To schedule a visit and to learn more about this initiative, please go to our website, https://asiasociety.org/triennial. For our members who are tuning in this evening, we thank you for your steadfast support of our work, especially now during this critical moment. Your generosity nourishes our resolve to persevere despite these challenging times. And for those of you who are new to Asia Society, I encourage you to become a member. Membership details may be accessed on our website, asiasociety.org/support/membership. The program this evening will be formatted as a 45-minute moderated discussion, followed by about 10 minutes of question and answer period for the panelists at the end of the time. To submit a question, please send them through the comment or live chat sections of Facebook or YouTube platforms. This program is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the conversation and on our YouTube channel, and may be accessed for further reference. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelist. Dr. Roger F. Harris is Associate Professor and Director of the Institute for Collaborative Education at New Jersey City University and Adjunct Professor at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development at New York University. He has devoted over 45 years working in all levels of the United States education system. Harris has received numerous civic and community awards, including the John Stanford Education Heroes Award in 2000 and the National Distinguished Principal Award in 2001, both from the United States Department of Education. And he also received the President's Award in 2013 from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, Boston branch. Dr. Harris served 3 years of active duty with the United States Marine Corps, including a 13-month tour of duty with a combat unit in Vietnam. He's featured in Ken Burns and Lynn Novick's documentary, The Vietnam War, from 2017. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Karen Ishizuka. She is the Chief Curator of the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. A third-generation Japanese American specializing in Japanese American and Asian Pacific American history and culture, she's the author of Serve the People, Making Asian America in the 60s, from Verso Books in 2016. This was featured on PEN America's list of recommended books on protest. She curated the seminal Japanese American National Museum exhibition, America's Concentration Camps, Remembering the Japanese American Experience in 1994, which culminated in her book, Lost and Found, Reclaiming the Japanese American Incarceration, from University of Illinois Press in 2006. Among her award-winning documentaries is Toyo Miyatake, Infinitive Shades of Grey, from 2001, which is an official selection of the 2002 Sundance Film Festival. I'd also like to recommend to you her 1996 documentary, Looking Like the Enemy, which contributed to the inspiration of this conversation this evening. And I think it's a must view in relation to the discussion that we'll be having tonight. Dr. Ishizuka pioneered the historical and cultural significance of home movies in the United States, co-editing Mining the Home Movie, Excavation in Histories and Memories from University of California Press, 2007. She also served on the National Film Preservation Board and is the president of the Okura Mental Health Leadership Foundation. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Viet Thanh Nguyen. He is the Errol Arnold Chair of English and a university professor of English, American Studies and Ethnicity and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles. A distinguished writer, he's a winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and numerous other awards for his novel, The Sympathizer, from Grove Press in 2016. His other works include The Refugees, published by Grove Press in 2017, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, Harvard University Press from 2016, which was also a finalist for the National Book Award in Nonfiction and the National Book Critics Circle Award in General Nonfiction, and Race and Resistance, Literature and Politics in Asian America, Oxford University Press, 2002. He's a recipient of fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. He's also a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and the editor of Displaced, Refugee Writers on Refugee Lives from Henry and Abrams, 2018. His most recent publication, Chicken of the Sea, from McSweeney's Publishing in 2019, is a children's book written in collaboration with his 6-year-old son, Ellison. And finally, his next book, which we're all excited to get a copy, is the sequel to The Sympathizer, entitled The Committed, from Grove Press, and is forthcoming in March 2021. And last but not least, I would like to introduce Lynn Novick, who is an acclaimed documentary filmmaker. In collaboration with Ken Burns, she has created more than 80 hours of programming, including the Vietnam War from 2017, of which we'll see a short clip this evening, Prohibition from 2011, Baseball, which was from 1994 to 2010, The War from 2007, Jazz from 2001, and Frank Lloyd Wright in 1998 for the Public Broadcasting Services. She is the recipient of numerous accolades, including an Emmy Award for Outstanding Informational Series in 1995, a Peabody Award, and the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Award. Novick made her solo directorial debut with College Behind Bars, produced with her producer and creative collaborator, Sarah Botstein. This 4-part series tells the story of a small group of incarcerated men and women struggling to earn college degrees in one of the most rigorous prison education programs in America, the Barred Prison Initiative. Presently, Novick is in development of a major series on the history of crime and punishment in America. She's also collaborating with Botstein, Burns, and Geoffrey C. Ward on several projects, including a 3-part biography on Ernest Hemingway, an exploration of America's response to the Holocaust, and a series on the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. And before we begin our conversation this evening, I just wanted to acknowledge that today is Veterans Day, and I'd like to take a moment to thank the many veterans and active service members who may be watching this evening, including a member of our Asia Society staff, John Huang, who's Assistant Director of Policy Programs and Global Initiatives, and our fellow panelist, Dr. Roger Harris. So
thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
So before we begin the discussion, I thought we would start with a short clip from Lynn's 2017 documentary, The Vietnam War. This is just 3 very short clips of what was over a 10-part series and over 18 hours of footage with hundreds of interviews. So it's just kind of thinking about the different perspectives at play. And so if we could just run that now, that would be wonderful.
While I was there, I had the opportunity to call my mother, and I was telling my mother what was happening over there, and I was telling her how she shouldn't believe what she sees in the newspaper and sees on television because we're losing the war. I said, you'll probably never see me again because we're the most northern outpost that the Marines have. We literally could look right into North Vietnam. We could see the sparks when the guns fired on us. And I said, everybody in my unit's dying. I probably won't be coming back. And my mother said, no, you're coming back. She said, I talk to God every day, and you're special. You're coming back. And I said, Ma, everybody's mother thinks that they're special. I'm putting pieces of special people in bags.
Tôi đã chứng kiến là phía bên Mỹ người ta mất. Mặc dầu ngôn ngữ tôi không biết, nhưng mà họ vẫn khóc, họ vẫn điều dìu với nhau. Khi họ bị thương á, họ cũng kè với nhau, rồi họ cũng khiêng xác với nhau, mà họ khóc rất nức nở. Rồi tôi đã chứng kiến cái đó thì tôi nghĩ rằng người Mỹ cũng như người Việt của chúng tôi thôi, cũng có cái tình thương bao la như thế, nhưng mà họ vẫn đùm bọc với nhau. Và cái đó là cái mà làm cho tôi suy nghĩ.
I was brought up to believe that the communists were people who would destroy the family, destroy religion, and people who had no allegiance to our country, but to international communism. My mother would describe them as đầu trâu mặt ngựa, which means that these are people with the head of a water buffalo and the face of a horse, meaning that they were subhumans and they were brutal. But on the other hand, I thought they also include people like my sister Thang and a lot of my cousins. I couldn't quite reconcile the 2 images. But of the 2, I think the other image was much stronger because I was so scared of them. I thought, these people must be really, really horrible people. That was the frame of mind I had when I started doing research into the communist movement.
Zwang Von Mai was the daughter of an official in the South Vietnamese government and was now married to an American, David Elliott. Back in 1964, she had gone to work for the Rand Corporation in Saigon. The think tank had been commissioned by Robert McNamara to do a study of enemy prisoners to find out who are the Viet Cong and what makes them tick.
I remember my first interview. I was by myself. I was very young, and I was going to this pretty grim prison to interview this high-ranking cadre who had been captured. I went in thinking I'm going to meet this beast You know, this guy with the head of a water buffalo and the face of a horse. He walked in and he was very surprised to see me, and just as surprised as I was to see him. Here was a man who had devoted all his life to fight for what he called a just cause, to free his country of foreign domination, to reunify the country under just government. So he really totally believed in it, to the point that he sacrificed his whole life to this cause. So I left, I was very impressed with him.
When the Rand report was presented to McNamara's top deputies at the Pentagon, describing the Viet Cong as a dedicated enemy that could only be defeated at enormous cost, one senior official said, "If what you say is true, we're fighting on the wrong side, the side that's going to lose this war."
So Lynn, thank you so much for sharing that really wonderful spectrum of experiences through your documentary. You know, just to quote a recent op-ed that Viet had written, you know, he writes that all wars are fought twice. The first one on the battlefield rather, and the second time in memory. And I'd like to say that, you know, there's a third kind of battle to be waged in the definition of history. And as we can see from those very short clips, there's so many nuanced perspectives, and I think everybody has a very subjective view. And so histories are very tricky. And I guess I would pose the first question to you, Lynn, you know, through this epic documentary, with a subject that I think most people feel that they have a knowledge of, although when you probably dig, you know, a little bit under the surface, people probably know very little other than what they know from popular culture. How did you go about tackling this subject? And, you know, what was your point of reference, I guess, that you used?
Yeah, well, first, I just want to say thank you for having me, and what a pleasure it is to share the virtual stage with some of my heroes. Just, you know, great to be with Roger and Viet and Karen. I greatly admire your work and the incredible research you've done to help us tell these stories. So thank you for having us. This was a daunting project, and we talked a lot among ourselves whether we should even tackle the Vietnam War. And one of the questions was, hasn't it been done? And first of all, I agree completely that every generation has to kind of re-examine the history that we've been told or taught through the lens of who we are and where we are. And so, you know, I think it will bear retelling again in another generation. But we felt that we didn't know that much about the Vietnam War or the American War, depending on your perspective. And that one of the things we really didn't understand was the multiplicity of Vietnamese perspectives. We knew America was deeply divided about the war, and there were many different ways of thinking about it that had divided our country. But we really had very little idea of what it meant for the people of Vietnam or the peoples of Vietnam. And so we didn't want to recapitulate the same way that Americans, as Viet has so beautifully said, when Americans talk about the Vietnam War, so often we're talking about ourselves. We didn't want to do that. We wanted to really take the time to try to understand this war from every side. And there are many, many sides to it. So that was kind of the guiding principle. And to be honest, my colleagues were not sure that we, who haven't done a film like this before, could, in fact, do justice to the many perspectives about the war and what happened and how the story should be told. But you know, we just kind of made a leap of faith that we would go to Vietnam and we would get to know the Vietnamese American community here as much as we could, and here just be present and let people tell us what they remembered, what they thought. And for me, one of the first ways into the story, frankly, was reading a beautiful novel called The Sorrow of War by a veteran of the North Vietnamese Army, Bao Ninh. Sometimes I find personally, you know, beautifully wrought fiction can help me get a human purchase on a story. So, you know, I read that book multiple times, but it helped me at least to begin to think about the war, the American war in Vietnam, the Vietnam War here, from the perspective of ordinary soldiers there. That was just a tiny little crack in. And from there, we just kept on trying to talk to people, get to know them, hear their stories, not really knowing where we would end up.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I would like to then turn the question to you, Viet. When we were speaking before we went live, you mentioned that you can't separate stories from power. And, I think from other platforms where I've heard you speak or heard, written some of your recollections of your experiences, your life was directly affected, and the trajectory of your family's future was directly affected by the American-Vietnam War. And I think, just growing up in America and experiencing one type of narrative, how did you feel empowered or the agency to share this other side of history, most poignantly through The Sympathizer, but through many of your other writings?
Well, I certainly, I grew up as a refugee in San Jose, California in the 1970s and 1980s. So I was deeply familiar with the Vietnamese refugee experience and the perspective that Mai Elliott talked about in terms of being, devotedly anti-communist and not being able to regard communists as human beings. And I also grew up as an American. So I was deeply aware of American perspectives because all you had to do was turn on the TV or go to the movies and see the Vietnam War being fought again and again by Americans. Mm-hmm. And so I grew up with this sense that everybody's memories and stories matter, obviously, and it's normal for Americans to focus on their own experiences, but not everybody has equal access to the means of representation or the means of having their stories amplified. And so this is a very ironic war in one sense, because even though Americans lost the war, in fact, they've won the war in memory, at least on the global stage. So, Lynn talked about Bao Nin's The Sorrow of War. It's an incredible novel, but I think most Americans and most people of the world have not heard of that book. And if they have heard of that book, it's possibly the only book they've read from a North Vietnamese perspective, whereas the entire world has been sort of irradiated by American stories. So for those of us who work in the terrains of storytelling and of memory and of history, we're faced with this kind of a problem where, again, we know everybody's stories matter, everybody's memories count to themselves, but there's this whole other dimension of power and access and control that takes place in terms of whose movies get made, whose books get published, and all of that. So we have to be very aware of that dimension of power when it comes to storytelling as well. And our struggle for justice in terms of memory, of history, and stories has to be focused not just on the individual storyteller like myself, but also on this whole terrain of who gets access to making and telling and broadcasting and publishing stories.
Yes, I agree. And I would like to go back to this thread about memory. But before we move there, I would like to then pose the next question to you, Karen, because, I think this experience of kind of living in this duality, right, of, having this experience living in the Vietnamese refugee community, but then also being an American and having this kind of and maybe I'm superimposing this on you, Viet. If so, erroneously, I apologize. But this kind of duality within oneself, of identity and, sense of community within America, I don't think that's necessarily a new or unique situation to the American-Vietnam War. And I would ask you, Karen, maybe through your extensive research in looking into modern wars, from World War II to the present, and really speaking with many Asian American veterans, talk a little bit about that duality or kind of the experiences that they incurred.
Okay, thank you. As you mentioned, Michelle, I am a Sansei, which is a third generation Japanese American. And I think the Japanese American ethnic community here might be the only one who really self-identifies in terms of our culture, in terms of how long we've been here in the US. So my grandparents came in the early 1900s. They were Issei, first generation, could not become naturalized citizens until 1952. My parents were born and raised in Southern California. And, on this Veterans Day, I'd like to acknowledge that My father and I think 5 or 6 of my uncles fought in World War II. One of them being killed the day after he helped save the Lost Battalion, which I don't think we think about is the day after some of these major events. So, it really wasn't until the American-Vietnam War and the beginning of the Asian American movement, in the 60s and 70s, that helped me make sense of sort of this broader socio-political milieu. So if Kelly, if you could show the image, please. This is and I don't know if you can see it, read it. This is a political cartoon by Alan Takemoto that was on the cover of the Ghidra magazine, which was one of the first and foremost Asian American movement newspapers of May 1972. So you can see that the Asian American soldier is saying, "What should I do now, Joe?" And the American soldier is saying, "Kill that gook, you gook." So, we came of age actually during the Vietnam War. And, I'd like to also read something else that came from Ghidra in 1973 that was written by Bruce Iwasaki, who is now a Los Angeles Superior Court judge. So he wrote in 1973, "The U.S. involvement in Vietnamese affairs began around the time we were born, stayed hidden from the national consciousness during our years of innocence, escalated as we matured, and has reached climactic proportions while our generation gains the will and seeks the mean to end the involvement. Much as we forget, ignore, or grow numb to it, the war has been a constant shadow in our lives." So it was really the Vietnam War that really catalyzed many of us to understand our position as and race in America. I think in America, it's usually race is usually polarized between black and white. So it was really a way for us to understand how racism affected us. And part of the Asian American movement was a search for historical recovery, actually. So it was during that time that we learned, probably for the first time, about the World War II incarceration, as well as the segregated 442nd. So it was during that time and through talking to so many veterans, as you mentioned, Michelle, that we came to understand, a larger understanding of how the wars and the aggression against Asians that the United States has perpetrated throughout that really helped define us.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and I was so struck, watching your documentary, Looking Like the Enemy. I'm a Asian American by birth, and it really struck me that in World War II, Korean War, and Vietnam War, they were all on Asian soil, and just kind of the complexities of these Asian American servicemen and women who had to go and were, given direct orders to, in probably very stark terms, kill the enemy. But the enemy looks like them, and they probably had family that were in some of those locales. And so just the inner angst and complexities of that must have been very challenging. And I would like to also raise, what you're talking about, this activism and this kind of growing sense of a cultural self. The term Asian American is a recent term, coined in 1968, as I'm sure you well know, in California. And so, thinking about the birth of that on these college campuses and within these kind of intellectual circles, do you think, or would you say that the kind of resistance to the American Vietnam War had a great, because at that time, people's sentiments were really turning against America's push to continue. And do you think for the Asian American community that really was a catalyst or a determining factor in this moment where there's a definitive self-definition as Asian American rather than, Chinese or Japanese or Filipino, and coming together with other inter-ethnic coalitions?
Just a word on the film, Looking Like the Enemy. It was, I produced this film along with my husband, Bob Nakamura, in 1995 for an exhibit that the Japanese American National Museum had called Fighting for Tomorrow. And basically it was about veterans through the wars up to that time. So it was for an exhibit. So it was structured in short segments of interviews of veterans who had served in World War II, the Korean War, and the Southeast Asian conflict. And they talked too about, the double war that they fought. They were fighting for democracy abroad, but were really fighting racism at home and also within the ranks as well. So, many of these stories that the vets told, they were, especially in the Vietnam War, they were used as an example of what the enemy looks like. They were being mistaken by the enemy for the enemy, including not getting medical treatment, almost getting jettisoned out of a helicopter. And they knew that they had to, and some knew in World War II, that they had to pay this price in blood to prove their work. So, like you were saying, that so many didn't talk about this. I mean, soldiers don't talk too much about the war. And many of them had not talked about their feelings before. And it was, a very low budget two-person crew. It was my husband and I. And we heard some later that, many of the wives, afterwards said that they had never heard of these stories. Which gets to, that whole storytelling and power and history and, what gets told and from whose point of view. And I have to say, in terms of the experience of working on this, I was concerned actually of being a woman, never having been in combat or the service, asking these questions, and very, very sensitive questions. Of these vets. And so it was interesting that, I think most of the World War II vets, I think they saw me more as an interested grandchild or niece. And so it was like they're helping me with a homework problem or something. That was their sort of their excuse of opening up, that, they would help me. And I think that through it was a catalyst, and it was, as I had mentioned, very much a reason that Asian Americans, so small in number on individual ethnic wise, that had no voice, collective voice, who were ignored, who were not considered. Being neither white nor black, in this country, of what were we, how were we, how would we, make a difference? So, it really was very much the war that added to a sense of a change from the otherness of an Oriental to a political identity as an Asian American.
Excellent. Thank you. I'd like to go to a point that Karen made in her remarks just now about, many of the veterans that she interviewed and spoke to, that there was a disconnect, right, between what they were fighting for and what they were experiencing at home. And I don't think that that's limited to just the Asian American community, but I think very much also could apply to the African American community. And I would turn to Dr. Harris to share some thoughts about that and his, impetus for participating in the war, and kind of, how that experience shaped his feelings and understanding of the United States, both during combat and then perhaps upon his return. If you could.
Well, thank you. I first would like to thank you for inviting me to participate in the panel. I also would like to thank Lynn again for allowing me to tell my story, or part of my story, in the documentary, The Vietnam War. And I need to begin by saying America obviously needs a paradigm shift. Race and racism are learned constructs. They're learned constructs. They're socially constructed behaviors to maintain control and authority. And racism and inequality manifests in various ways, and inferior education is one. And so when I think back to my own experience, why did I go? And what happened there and what happened when I returned, I can attribute it to ignorance. I didn't know. I wasn't politically astute. I was young. I wasn't going to college. And the military, the Marine Corps has outstanding propaganda, recruitment initiatives. And I drank the Kool-Aid. And I also need to say that I'm fourth generation from descendants of slaves in North Carolina. And I was raised by my mother and my grandmother. And my grandmother only went as far as the 3rd grade, and my mother only went as far as the 10th grade. And neither one of them ever spoke to me about college because they hadn't graduated from high school. High school graduation was an accomplishment. And so that was the only conversation around education in my house. You have to graduate from high school. And I barely graduated from high school. And when I did, I joined the Marine Corps because to me, it was a viable job option. I felt that one of two things would happen. If I go to Vietnam and I die, my mother will be rich. She'll receive $10,000, which I thought was a lot of money back then, and she'd be able to buy a house. And if I lived, I'd be accepted in society, and I'd probably be able to land a good job. And so I joined the Marine Corps because I thought I was macho, thought I was tough, and I thought the Marines were the toughest branch, and so I wanted to go with the toughest. But I was ignorant to the politics of war. I had never met a Vietnamese person. I didn't even know where Vietnam was, and I went to Vietnam with that ignorance. I was, in my mind, I was a warrior. I was a trained killer from America, and I was going to rescue South Vietnamese from the insurgent North Vietnamese communists. And I went over there with that mindset. And I was fortunate because once I was there, I realized that it wasn't like what I had been told, and it was totally different. And we were caught up in a civil war. And we had people like Muhammad Ali, who were back in the States refusing to go to Vietnam and saying, I'm not going to Vietnam to kill other brown people. And those folks never called me nigger. And so I was caught. I was there, representing the United States. And I was trained to kill, and and Vietnamese soldiers were trying to kill me. And so it became, a matter of survival. I think Lynn and Ken do an excellent job of documenting what happened when I returned after going through experiencing all those atrocities of war. And I returned, to the same racism that not only I and my generation experienced, but, African Americans throughout the history of this country have experienced. Historically, Americans of African descent have participated in every war since the death of Crispus Attucks at the Boston Massacre, which ignited the American Revolution. And African Americans, have, just like myself, have thought that, if we go to war by being a patriot and fighting for this country and paying in blood, that maybe will be accepted. And even now, in 2020, we see what's happening. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you, as a person of color, it doesn't matter, to many in this country, what sacrifices you make. But again, I think it's all rooted in ignorance. It's rooted in ignorance and fear. And it's and the condition that we're under, whether we're Asian American or Asians or Americans from African descent, we've been manipulated, by since the inception of this country, since slavery, by wealthy landowners, the oligarchs who have a way of creating names and buckets and pitting people against each other. And I promised myself when I was in Vietnam, I promised myself and I promised God that if I returned, if I survived, I would dedicate my life to working with youth so that they wouldn't have to go through what I went through, so they wouldn't have to experience war, so that they wouldn't have to kill, people that they don't know, being manipulated by folks that they don't know. And so, I've committed my life to doing that. And I feel totally blessed that I was able to come back and experience what I have. And I'm not sure if I answered your question.
You did, thank you. I think a common thread that I've been finding through your various responses is, thinking about this sense of, memory, representation, and agency, and the kind of disconnect or, many individuals, whether, from trauma or, for many Asians feel like they want to be like the model, or not that they want to be, but they are seen as the model minority. They don't want to speak up. They don't want to cause trouble, kind of burying this representation of their experiences or of this other perspective, and kind of the propagandic use by the government of war to, further socioeconomic, political aims. Just thinking about this idea and how going forward, can we, in our respective capacities as storytellers or as kind of receptacles or, using our platform to amplify other perspectives, how can we change this dynamic that, the disenfranchised or those who are less empowered, continue to be manipulated or underrepresented, and then this kind of power structure, how can we kind of dismantle that power structure through our work? I think, Lynn, you raised your hand.
I raised my hand. I want to kind of answer maybe the first half of your question. I think there's so much important ideas in what you said, but as you were speaking, I was just thinking about, both the experience of the 442nd. I had the honor of meeting a number of veterans of that unit as well, including Senator Inouye and Roger Harris and all the other veterans that I got to know of the Vietnam War on the American side and the Vietnamese side. Something has to happen where you train the government, whoever, the entity, the Communist Party, the South Vietnamese government, the American government, whoever trains young men to kill other people who they don't know. And you have to dehumanize those people so that they'll do it, right? And so, that's just a fundamental truth of war and of the kind of propaganda that you're talking about and the dehumanization. I think the way you have to fight that, and the way to fight that is to put a human face on the other people, whoever the enemy, the capital E enemy, the caricature, the boogeyman, whatever the words are, they're people. And so one of the things like the clip that we showed of Lê Công Nguyen talking about seeing the Americans with their dead and realizing, they care about their brothers who died too, just like us. They have humanity too, was a way for us of flipping the mirror a little bit and saying, just for an American audience, wait, this is how other people see us. This is how we might be seeing them. And just to kind of break that up a little bit, I think is the first step to me of just everyone's common humanity. I mean, it's a cliche, but it's so true. And it doesn't take, war is so inherently traumatic But, people build up not wanting to talk about it, first of all, but also not really wanting to deal with what has happened to themselves, to their friends, to the people that they've killed or hurt, and sort of recognizing common humanity across these artificial constructed divisions of race and ethnicity are, to me, the first step. And that's why working on this film for me was such a life-altering experience, frankly. I do think, and that's what in everyone here's work, we're all trying to do in different ways.
If I could just add to that, I think one of the things that we have to be really aware of is what constitutes war in the first place, and who is involved in a war in the first place. And Dr. Harris brought up the idea that we're subjected to propaganda in this country, which is an important thing to acknowledge, because we generally think, oh, it's the Russians or the Chinese who do propaganda, but we're pretty good at it ourselves. There's a line in my novel, The Sympathizer, where I say Hollywood is the unofficial ministry of propaganda for this country, because we see this very clearly when it comes to war. It tells us a particular story about Americans at war when it comes to war movies. It's about soldiers. It's mostly about white men. And to acknowledge what Lynn talked about, it's very difficult for Americans, or for really any people, to think about their enemy and what the enemy is experiencing. But even beyond that, we really are conditioned to think of war as something that involves soldiers. And from my experience growing up in this refugee community, I was deeply aware of the fact that the war certainly traumatized South Vietnamese soldiers. And the war didn't end in 1975 for these soldiers. That's another thing. Americans like to think wars begin and wars end. It's all very neat, but the ripples of war continue for decades and decades. We certainly see this in American history, that we're not done with the Civil War. Why would we be done with the Vietnam War at this point? And so you see South Vietnamese soldiers deeply traumatized and not even being able to talk about their trauma, because that language doesn't exist in the South Vietnamese community. And there's huge consequences for their children, their grandchildren, and so on and so forth. But beyond that, the war affected not just soldiers and men, but women and children and civilians. And you see that certainly in terms of just participants in the war in Vietnam, but also the fact that the war damaged so many lives of people who had no intention of being at war, but they simply couldn't escape it. And I talk a lot about refugees. And one of the things I talk about is that refugees are an outcome of war. So it's not as if we can just talk about war in the battlefield and the soldiers and what they did and what happened to them and what happens when they came home. But refugees themselves are the living embodiments of war. And Americans try to contain that by thinking about refugees simply as people who have come to this country as immigrants. But, they came here because of a war that many of them had no choice in being caught up in. So I think it's a very important thing to acknowledge on a Veterans Day, because obviously crucial to acknowledge our veterans, but we also should think about why we acknowledge veterans and foreground veteran experiences. It helps us to not think about what war has done to the enemy and also to civilians as well.
To the larger society.
Yeah, I would just like to chime in on that, because I think I found one of the things I found most chilling in working on the film was listening to the audio tapes from the White House of the people in charge deciding what to do, debating strategy, and the way they discussed bombing, collateral damage, civilian casualties was beyond. To talk about dehumanization, the actual cost of war, the civilians pay the highest price, and it's happening far away from the Pentagon or the White House or whoever they're sending the bombers off to do this damage. Not to mention everything that happens on the ground. There's a huge disconnect. Easy to do when you're half a world away, but inexcusable of who's really paying the price. I agree completely with Viet. So
it's Smedley Butler. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with that name, but Smedley Butler is the most decorated Marine that ever lived. I think he won 2 Congressional Medals of Honor along with numerous other awards. But he's written a small book. It's called War is a Racket. And it's almost like a self-confession. He compares the military to organized crime. And he says that he was the muscle man, in taking the Philippines. He led the Marines into the Philippines. And he goes on and on and on, whether it's the Caribbean or whether it's the Philippines. He goes on and on just to show how the military, and under his direction, particularly the Marines, were able to expand the empire and put money in the pockets of the fat cats. And so someone asked a question about what can we do? We first need to start with education, because folks need to understand what this war thing is all about and who the enemy is. One of the things that I learned from participating in Lynn's documentary, and like many other veterans, I didn't talk about the war when I got back unless I was talking with other Marines, because no one back here, the general public, didn't understand. When I came back, facing the racism, we're also facing being called baby kill, the anti-war movement. And then, there were, even black folks who were criticizing me because I fought for the man, and it was just a whole lot of stuff. And so, I just retreated, and I was fortunate enough to get into a university, and I just dove into that. And so I put the war out of my mind, tried to put it out of my mind. And it wasn't until I met Lynn and Sarah and got invited to participate in this documentary that I actually start sharing things about it. And since then, I've met other Marines, and I heard Viet say that, war is fought twice. I wish it was only fought twice. I fight the war every night. I get 3 hours of sleep a night. It's a record that plays, on and on and on in my head, every night. And I'm not the only person that happens to. So again, what is the solution? I think we need to create a paradigm shift. In America, we glorify violence, we glorify war. We train kids from the time that they're little, whether it's cartoons or whether it's the movies, that whoever knows the most karate, whoever's the fastest gun, whoever can kill or beat the most people gets the pretty girl. And so, kids, particularly boys, grow up with that. If you want to be, the hero, you have to be a killer. You have to be a tough guy. And we have to somehow create a different paradigm where, where the hero, is the one who solves problems by using his or her head and not by violence. And so I think that's where it needs to start.
I think that's sage advice. And I would like to go back to a comment that you made yet early on in the conversation about, we have to dismantle the established kind of system, right, that allows for certain dialogues and empower other voices. And, what are strategies that you would recommend to kind of accelerate the dismantling of these kind of more calcified hierarchies?
The problem, I think, is that what we're talking about can't be separated from the discussion of American society as a whole. Dr. Harris touched on this point. There's a structural inequality in American society around race and class. Everybody should be getting a university education, but a lot of people can't get it. People are shut out of the very avenues that we need to have opened in order to have a transformative conversation about war, about inequality, and so on and so forth. So, number one, obviously, for those of us who have made it, quote unquote, whatever that means, it's our obligation not to be gatekeepers, but to throw open the gates. So, sometimes I'm called a voice for the voiceless, and I freak out when I hear that because I've never made that claim. And if you've ever been in a Vietnamese community, we are not voiceless. We're really, really loud. Okay. We're not voiceless. We're just not heard. And I'm not interested in being a voice for the voiceless. I'm interested in abolishing the conditions of voicelessness. That's the project of the Asian American movement that Karen has talked about. So for those of us who have somehow been able to make it through and have become these kinds of spokespeople and so on, we have to constantly draw attention to the fact that we need more voices and more people out there speaking, and we need to get as many people like us out there as possible. And what that means is that we have to create conditions of possibility. Dr. Harris is engaged in education. We cannot change this problem until more people have access to more education, have access to becoming producers and writers and publishers and so on, which means everybody has to be committed to this. If you're in a situation where you're a producer, for example, you got to make sure your production company has diverse young people being hired and being brought on board, the same as in publishing. So these are structural changes that each of us individually cannot transform by ourselves. We need a societal transformation in order to have a transformation in our understanding of storytelling and all that. And I'll end with the last example. touches on this issue of propaganda and race and how we remember the Vietnam War. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr., everybody knows Martin Luther King Jr., and they know him oftentimes through one text, which is, "I Have a Dream." It's an incredible speech. But it's American propaganda that we only know, for the most part, this speech, and not Beyond Vietnam, which is like a 30-minute speech where he gets into exactly these issues that we've been talking about. And
which is why he was killed.
Exactly, right. It's a condemnation of racism, militarism, and capitalism. You can't say that in American society, and we don't even teach it. So it's up to us to find these stories and to amplify them. And if we're teachers, it's up to us not just to recycle the propaganda, but to do it's not even hard work, to read that speech by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and teach it as a part of our history of the Vietnam War.
Can I say two things? One, recently I was asked, what am I going to do now that I've retired? I retired 5 years ago as a superintendent in Massachusetts. And I was talking with a gentleman who was a venture capitalist from China, a very wealthy gentleman. And I said, I'd like to create a world peace school. And he said, what do you mean by that? And I had been traveling back and forth to China. I've been to China now 16 times in the last 9 years. And I said, I've been traveling between 10, 15 cities in China, and New York, Boston, cities around the United States. And I see beautiful families, beautiful American families. And since I've been going to China, I see more similarities in families, with families. The propaganda that I was fed about China was blown away when I started traveling to China. I said, so what I would like to do is I'd like to bring Chinese kids, young Chinese kids together with young American kids, because every time I travel to China, I sit and I wonder, 5, 10, 15 years from now, some politician can have these little kids trying to kill these little kids in New York City, and what can I do, to avoid that? And I think back to when I was 19 and I volunteered to go kill Vietnamese and was ready to die. I didn't know any Vietnamese. I think if we can bring kids together at a young age, get them to know each other, teach them leadership skills, so as they emerge in their various countries, they'll be less likely to press the button. When I came back with that idea, I met with a friend of mine, a Jewish lady. She said, Roger, that's a great idea to bring Chinese kids and American kids together, but why don't you do the same thing for Palestinians and Israelis? And then I started thinking about, how adults have their heels dug in, but we have to break the cycle with the children. Last thing I want to say is the evolution of war. We talk about the humanity or inhumanity of war. If we think about how we're programming our kids now with this technology, and my youngest son is probably on a computer right now playing some ridiculous game, where they're killing people to gain points. And what that does is it desensitizes kids to that fact. And my oldest son had a friend, who now works for the government, and he's under a bunker in Wyoming somewhere, flying drones, over in the Middle East, doing the same types of things. And so the face of war is changing. The war is evolving, and it's taking more and more sensitivity away from it. And so, we as the so-called educators, we have platforms like the university, or like movie making or filmmaking. We have to, create that paradigm shift that educates kids in a different way.
Any last words? Yes, Karen.
Yes, and that paradigm shift on how to change kids in a significant way, and in terms of strategy, I'd like to say that, one very tangible thing that we're doing at the Japanese American National Museum is, I'm leading the new core exhibit, and it is tentatively titled Made in America, which is after Viet's comment that, I was born in America, but I was born in Vietnam, but I was made in America, which really underscores that concept of, regardless of national origin, it's what you do and what you work with that makes you an American. So, in terms of a paradigm shift, it really is, instead of succumbing to a conventional mandate for BIPOC to assimilate into standards of white America, it really is an attempt for white America to acknowledge, affirm the existence and the agency, of its multicultural composition. We're doing two things. One is, instead of just remembering Japanese American history, we're trying to really locate and amplify the lessons from Japanese American history for American democracy. And the second thing that we're doing is really contextualizing the Japanese American story within an entire American story. So we will be reaching out and making linkages with different communities that have similar and same experiences. And it really is only in this whole concept of this paradigm shift. We are working toward a majority minority population, whether people like it or not, that is where we are going. So we need things, tangible things, the education system, but things like museums, books, films, etc., that push this paradigm shift so that our youth get the message from all over, and it's not just one source or yes. A small perspective.
Yes.
Any other final words from the other panelists? I mean, I think
I don't know what time it is or anything, having such a fascinating conversation, but I was just going to throw in that, relatively recently there is an ongoing backlash, if you want to call it that, or I don't know what the right word is, against a more inclusive, pluralistic vision of America. We're all aware of this. And, I heard it said recently by the soon to be outgoing president that, history teaches people to hate America. And we should only be telling stories about what a great country this is and celebrating our, great values. And the kids are being told to hate America in history class, with which I, of course, completely disagree. But I think that is a reality that's out there. And I think, the sort of recognizing that is a force, that perspective is there, and that we have to constantly remind ourselves and our fellow countrymen that a complicated, honest, true story about our country and our flaws and our incapacities and our injustices is the only way we do get to the place you're talking about. It's not specific to anyone. There's many different ways in which this plays out. So, but, I feel it's really important to just be constantly on vigilant about how important it is to tell the true stories of a very complicated past and present.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. So, I mean, I love how all of you look at the past to find the way forward. And I feel that you have really shared some really thoughtful and optimistic, ways forward for us to become a more inclusive and more empathetic society, despite certain strains in our communities. But I think, unfortunately, we've run out of time. This has been such an enlightening and, dynamic conversation for me. And I just thank you all again for your generosity of time and your expertise and sharing your insights. So I appreciate that. And thank you all of you who are tuning in via Zoom from your homes and from other platforms. Thank you for joining us. And please come back to Asia Society again soon. And thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.